Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everybody, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And today I've got Earl Lee returning, the author of From the Bodies of the Gods. Pardon me. That just hit me right when I was going to speak and I didn't have a chance to mute. I apologize for that, folks. I've been doing nose irrigations, but I don't think they've had effect yet. We just went through all that rain and I just recently got my voice back, so I'm getting back on my show, but I'm not 100% back to normal. At any rate, I was going to say before that cough hit me suddenly out of nowhere was I think if I remember correctly, had run out of time the last time he was on the air. So I think with this being a Saturday, that should not happen again. And I've got a chance to finish reading his book and got a list of questions ready for him. And he made a notation of where he was at so that we don't lose our place. And, you know, it's a really interesting book he's got about hallucinogenics and the cult of the dead. You know, he's researched it all the way back from Atlantis and up through the Sumerians, all the way into the Hebrews and the early church. And for all we know, I wouldn't say it's impossible that maybe in some parts of the world this occult might still be alive and thriving somewhere that ain't in mainstream media for all, you know, we might know. I mean, just look at it this way. If the Mayans were still out there, would we know if they were having their own little cult of the dead? Or would we find out about it when people went to visit them? So I'm just saying anything's possible. Earl, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good.
Well, I want to thank you for returning to my show. And, you know, like I said earlier, I do apologize for any troubles I'm having with my voice. As you know, we just went through like a whole entire month of rain every day, and that affects my mold allergy because we had some boards in the house that had gotten moldy when they got wet due to a sink leak I haven't fixed yet. So every time it rains, it activates the mold on that, and that activates my allergy. And a month of it caused me to lose my voice. And, well, you know, I'm still not, you know, 100% back, but we're still not 100% out of the moisture area either. So I'm going to muddle through this show the best I can. If I do cough a few times before I can get to mute, I apologize, especially when it happens when I'm talking.
Well, I wish you would send some of that rain this way because we've had a drought now, and we only had one day of rain in the last 2 months. So Kansas could use some of that if you want to send it this way.
Well, what area are you in?
Southeast Kansas.
Southeast Kansas?
Yeah, we've had a drought now for a long time.
Aren't you just north of Houston?
No, I'm, you know where Joplin, Missouri is?
Okay, so you're kind of north and east, or east. Or
just northwest of Joplin, yeah, about 30 miles. So we were there, you know, when the tornado happened, that was only like 30 miles away.
Wow. It's amazing you guys don't have any rain up there yet. At least I think it is, as much as we've been getting. So let's go ahead and go with the book real quick, like, just to bring people up to date. Why don't you tell them real quick, like, exactly what got you interested in this particular topic?
Well, I guess you'd say I had a long-standing interest in mythology, I guess starting with Greek mythology. And over time, I began reading about Egyptian mythology and the religions of that area, Egypt, Greece, the Near East, ancient Europe. And I began noticing a lot of similarities. Of course, you know, this is not a new idea because back, you know, the turn of the century, there were a lot of books that written comparing religions and the similarities between them. But I started seeing things that, particularly certain images and certain colors, that seem to be recurring over and over again in association with the dead and how they handled their dead. And so over time, I began researching those to find out, you know, what kind of burial practices did they use in Greece, what were they doing in Egypt, what were they doing in Palestine. And there were just a lot of strange things going on. And it was through studying that when I first got involved in this whole idea of what they were doing with the bodies of the dead.
Now, I think one of the things that I'd asked the last time, if I'm not mistaken, was whether or not these had ever actually been people that were sacrificed, or were they always people who had died naturally? Do you think there was ever a case that the cult of the dead was actually, because it would be kind of like murdering people for this purpose, and you would think that they, being a godly cult and trying to get into heaven, would want to do it without, committing murder, considering where they had to get the, oils from in that.
Well, let's think about it this way. Let's suppose you were living in this ancient culture, and you depended on funeral rites to maintain communications with the next world, with the gods, with your dead ancestors, and some kind of problem came up, or it was necessary to try to get the gods on your side, to have like a better weather, for example. I probably should think about that right now. Better weather, or that sort of thing. And so sometimes it was necessary to send, like you say, almost a messenger over. And so that would be a justification then for human sacrifice. But we know that these ancient cultures did sacrifice people, and that has been an argument for a long time. Back about 20, 30 years ago, they found a temple on the island of Crete that had collapsed right in the middle of a human sacrifice. Now, I don't remember if I mentioned this to you before or not, but what they had was, there was a young woman there who was the priestess who was running the show, and another older man, and then a third person who was participating in the rite. And they also found the body of this young man who had been kind of tied or trussed up, and he had been executed as part of the rite. And at that point, there was an earthquake, and the roof collapsed and killed the ones who weren't dead yet. But basically, what they think happened was there was an earthquake earlier, and that these people went to this temple to make the sacrifice very quickly, and then an aftershock caused the building to collapse. So we know, for example, and this was, I think it was about 600 BC when this happened on Crete. So we know, here's evidence, irrefutable evidence, that they were sacrificing humans. And in this particular case, it seems to be that they were doing this because they were afraid that this earthquake had happened. They wanted to stop. And so that's why they decided to execute this young man, or sacrifice this young man. And it's just, I guess it's lucky for us that we have this evidence now that is absolutely irrefutable that they did, in fact, sacrifice people on Crete.
Yeah, and I believe it's also pretty common knowledge that the Mayans did as well. And I think even the Bible records that they were sacrificing, I want to say babies. It's been a long time since I read it, and my memory could be mixed up, but if memory serves, I think that God got mad at them for sacrificing babies.
Well, there's a place in the Old Testament where the Hebrews criticized the local people for sacrificing to, I think it was the god Moloch, and they would throw babies in this furnace. But that was probably not, there were a lot of different cultures at that time all through that area where it was very traditional to sacrifice your firstborn, whether it was your firstborn cow or your firstborn sheep or your firstborn human. And so, being the oldest kid in the family was probably not the thing to enjoy. But, yeah, the first fruits were always dedicated to God. Now, later on in religious tradition, it became where your oldest son would become a priest. And so that comes from that old tradition going back many thousands of years, where the first fruits, the first child was God's, and you had to dedicate him to God. And if that meant human sacrifice, well, that's just the way it was.
And I think in the Sumerian legends I've read about, it was certain places, I forget, was it Ur or Chaldea or, one of the other towns around there, that volunteering to be a sacrifice was like a honor, and you actually got to be dressed up, treated like royalty for a while, and they made a big to-do out of you to honor the fact that you were sacrificing yourself to the gods.
Well, not only there, but also in the New World, they know that the the Mayans had this ball game they played in courts that I guess sort of resembles basketball, but if you were the best player in that game, that you would be the person who would be honored by being sacrificed. And I kind of ironic we're talking about this now when they have the Olympic Games going, but there are a couple of people I could see maybe sacrificing. There's a couple of people kind of obnoxious that we could start sacrificing. Oh, you're really good at a basketball player. Well, let's take him out here. But it was considered an honor, and you were considered during the time between your being chosen or the time of your victory and the point where you were actually sacrificed. You were treated as if you were the God. You were the God, and you could do whatever you wanted. You had the best of everything. But then, at the course of the end, you were sacrificed. But yeah, no, that's common throughout ancient history. I think not only in the old world, but the new world too. Yeah.
Well, do you think that this was mostly a belief or superstitious belief, or do you think there was ever any basis in reality for it at any point in time?
Well, the issue for people, 6,000 years ago is I don't think they understood the idea of, they didn't make whatever they saw they believed, and whether that experience came from day-to-day living or whether that experience came as a result of using a hallucinogen or something else, I don't think they made any distinctions. To them, that was their reality. And so it's probably, I don't know that I would say that they would treat it as superstition. To them, that was whatever they saw was real, and that's how they treated life. And so I think they were quite serious. They quite seriously believed that this young man had won this ball game, and so he's clearly fine enough or good enough to represent the God in this ritual sacrifice, and so we're going to sacrifice him in a couple of weeks, and then he will go to the next world where he will tell the gods what nice people we are and how upright and honorable we are and how we honor the gods through this sacrifice. And to them that was real. It's very real.
Yeah, and, I know that they had a lot of beliefs that was very real to them back then, and if you think about it, Earl, even in today's world, there's a lot of things that are believed and believed as valid, bona fide fact with little to no, backing or, evidence whatsoever, because people, I don't know, there's something about the human psyche seems to have a tendency to believe things right away, especially if it just, for reasons unknown, seems to resonate.
Well, when I talked to my wife's family, they were very traditional Catholics, and of course they didn't eat meat on Friday. They would have fish on Friday. And my wife just told me recently about her sister, how upset she got when she thought she might have accidentally eaten some meat that was used, that maybe some beef grease was used to make some French fries or something, and she got all upset about it and had to go to confession over it. And that may seem
very good example
strange to us, but it's not. There are a lot of cultures like that. Another story I find very bizarre but interesting. Do you remember there's a journalist named Ernie Pyle who was very popular in World War II, and a lot of his stuff has been anthologized. But there's one story he tells about a naval vessel, Allied naval vessel, where they had 3 young men go on board the ship, but they had forgotten. I guess all 3 of them forgot to bring their holy toilet seat, because you can't go to the bathroom unless you have this holy toilet seat to protect you from the evil spirits. And all 3 of them, I guess each one thought the other one had one, they could use his, but as it turned out, they got on the ship and none of them had it, and so they refused to go to the bathroom. And so, a week later, they actually had to take them off the boat in stretchers to take them to some place where they actually had this toilet seat they would use, because they simply refused to go. And that was because of their religious belief that if you use the bathroom without the holy toilet seat, well, these demons would fly up and then you would have this.
Okay. I am really sorry for what I was thinking. It's just that I used to make so many jokes about people that are always saying holy crap or holy shit about worship service in the bathroom at 10 or, something like that, that when you brought that up, it just dovetailed right into the jokes I used to make, and my mind couldn't help but go there.
Well, even today we have a man running for president who wears this strange underwear that is supposed to protect him from supernatural things. And my wife, when she was a girl, used to wear, do you know what a scapula is?
A scapula?
It's called a scapula. It's a little picture of a saint, and it's part of a necklace. And you had to, if you were a Catholic, a traditional Catholic, you pretty much had to wear one of those all the time, because that little picture of that saint would protect you from evil. And
I never heard of that, but I have heard somebody that told me they were an ex-Mormon that did say that they had to wear it was either something special on their underwear or had to wear special underwear in order to be a Mormon.
Yeah, there's a special underwear that they have to wear. It's white and it's got short sleeves and short legs. So people of that faith still do that today. Now the Catholics are a little away from the scapula, but how many people do you know who have a little plastic Jesus on their dashboard?
Just about almost everybody.
See, there's a lot of them, and that's their belief. They believe that helps some way, or at least it doesn't hurt. I guess, I suppose that maybe you can look at it that way. It may not help, but at least it's not going to hurt. I guess to have a little plastic Jesus or Mary on your dashboard, but of your car. But people do a lot of things that some religions find strange, and others, everybody does something a little weird, I guess. But yeah.
Okay, we got somebody in the chat room. I'd asked them how the sound was, and they said that the sound was okay, but they said that your volume was a little low. Wondered, do you have a volume button or something? Like, are you on a headphone set or something? You could turn it up a little?
Let me try this.
I've had people tell me this before.
Does that help any?
Well, I'll wait and see if the guests will mention that in the chat room, whether or not it helped him. He'll answer. I just have to wait and see what he says. I can't hear on his end, in other words. But, I've had people tell me this before about the volume, and I think there's something about the way Internet radio is set up, and because I use Skype to be able to do this, is somehow the guest voice is never as loud as or the secondary caller is never as loud as the primary caller, in other words.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Maybe it's just a common feature. Who knows? I mean, it's a fairly new technology, so I'm sure it's not perfected yet.
Okay. Yeah, well, I hope that helps a little bit. I have a little switch that says high and low on it, so I hit it up to high, and maybe that'll help.
Okay. I hope so. All right, now, here's one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, because this one, it stuck out like a sore thumb, and I mean, it wasn't very far into the book. It was like on page 39. I mean, not very far in at all. You was mentioning about the Nazarenes being part of the cult of the dead. Now, I found that interesting because when I read the book of Matthew in the Bible, it says, "And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, he will be called a Nazarene." The thing I find interesting about this is the scholars will tell you to this day, during the days of Jesus, there was no town called Nazareth, although we do know in the Old Testament, Solomon was a Nazarene, which would, if your research is correct, would make him a member of the cult of the dead, or being a part of it in the very least. But what I was going to say, since you can't find a prophecy anywhere in the Old Testament, because, I mean, if it said the prophecy was being fulfilled, then it should have been prophesied in the Old Testament somewhere. How can something not prophesied be fulfilled, in other words? But do you think perhaps Jesus could have been a member of the cult of the dead?
Well, I think that what had happened was that the religion as it existed at the time of Moses, it's 1200 BC or thereabouts, was essentially a combination of the Hebrew cult of the dead and the whatever they picked up from the Egyptians while they were living there. And so, but over time, the problem that the the aristocracy had there was that people following the cult of the dead meant mostly sacrificing at local shrines and family tombs and that sort of thing. And, of course, the priests in Jerusalem or the other major urban centers wanted those ties coming to them, not to some little church off in the woods somewhere. And so they began complaining and criticizing and saying, you know, why do you rely on the dead when you should be relying on Jehovah? And that was one of the things they said to criticize them. And why are you getting prophecies from these people in these little cult sites instead of coming here to the Jerusalem temple and talking to us and so on like that? So I think it was a slow process over a long period of time where they were critical of the people who worship along the old religious lines, the cult of the dead, as it was established by Moses. And we get to a point where the Jerusalem temple gets stronger and stronger, and it begins doing more and more policies to try to control the religious view, control the religion of the people. And when you get to the time of Jesus, he has some ideas that Jesus are pretty traditional Jewish beliefs at the time, but there's a lot there that still comes from the cult of the dead because he was from Galilee, where it was still being, remote rural area that's still being practiced. And so I think Jesus' ideas are really kind of a mix of what was commonly accepted by most Jews at the time and a mix of ideas that came from the cult of the dead as it existed in Galilee, not to mention the things he probably picked up while he was in Egypt, because we all know that Jesus spent much of his youth in Egypt, where the cult of the dead, in this case the cult of Osiris, was very much alive. So I think that it's fair to say that Jesus had a lot of attitudes and beliefs that came from the cult of the dead, and that the religion he taught was probably closer to the ideas of the local Samaritans than it was to what was being taught in the Jerusalem temple, which was very much, we're in charge, we're your only contact with Jehovah, you do what we say or else. And, so I think there was a group called the Nazarenes, which was, wasn't that a group where they didn't cut their hair or something like that?
Yeah, that was one of the rules for the Nazarenes. As a matter of fact, that was Samson's big downfall.
Right. And apparently the Sikhs have that same belief. Well, of course, you had this temple shooting last week, and the Sikhs don't cut their hair either. And that is a fairly common kind of religious idea, I think, is that you dedicate your life to God, and for that reason you don't use a razor or for any reason.
Yeah, and that makes a lot. A lot of sense that people could have a belief like that, and then it could make it into the Bible. Now, further down on the same page, I see the Galileans were implicated with the cult of the dead, and here again, Jesus is also called Jesus the Galilean, as well as the man from Galilee. Do you think there could be that maybe both of these here, like the prophecy and, further up in the page, as well as this thing about Jesus being called a Galilean, could be one of the Bible authors, the original writers or scriptors or whoever, trying to give a clue to future readers without coming out and saying it, that Jesus might have been a part of this?
Well, I think that what's happened over the centuries is that there's a lot of stuff that has just disappeared. For one reason or another, somebody objected to it, and so they just didn't bother to recopy that document, or they might even have destroyed it. But the things that have come through, they're usually little things here and there that point back to what the truth was. And I think, for example, let's say, the very oldest gospel we believe is the Gospel of Mark. And there, the very first page of the Gospel of Mark, it says that Jesus went out among the people teaching and anointing. But who anoints anymore? I mean, hardly anybody, except when they get baptized, or in some churches get anointed, but that was clearly one of his top priorities, teaching and anointing. And it says it right there in the Gospel of Mark. Well, how come churches don't teach that today?
A lot of things I think personally, and I could be wrong, the church don't want to teach because a lot of things I think they're not even sure the answers of themselves, and they're afraid if they touch certain things, they're going to get into a messy can of worms that they're not going to be able to answer.
Well, certainly there's a lot of stuff, especially in the early history of the church, that are hard to understand or peculiar, to say the least. And, there's a lot of stuff they just don't want to deal with anymore. They don't want to explain how they went from being a church that was persecuted in its first 400 years to a church that
was persecuting
everybody else. I mean, one of the reasons why we were unable to read Egyptian is because in the year 600, the church went into Egypt and took all the Egyptian priests and threw them in prison. And there was no one left who could read hieroglyphs. And so from 600 AD until the 19th century, when someone figured out how to read hieroglyphs again, we had no idea what any of those things said. And that's because the church went in there and deliberately suppressed that belief.
Yeah, and the thing is, it wasn't just the Egyptians. The church, they were suppressing other Christian groups. It didn't matter if they were Christian or not. It didn't matter if they professed a belief in God or not, or a faith in Jesus Christ, or accepted Jesus Christ. None of that mattered if their doctrine was considered heresy in any way, shape, or form. Then that church was to be shut down one way or another, even through the Inquisition or the Crusade, whatever it took, in other words. So, it's really kind of maddening if you ask me. It's kind of like going after your own.
Oh yeah, sure. A lot of Christians were persecuted by the church and were for centuries and centuries. And basically, the main litmus test, in my opinion, is did you submit to Rome or not? I mean, that was the ultimate question. Are you going to submit to Rome or not? And if you're not going to submit to Rome, then we'll find a reason to get rid of you.
I'm glad you said that. That was a very interesting point, and it was one I never thought of before. That was the question back then. It wasn't whether or not you're submitting to God or whether or not you're submitting to the church. The question, I think, back in the time was always, were you submitting to Rome? But it was under the disguise of the church and God.
Yeah, they could always find a reason to come after you, whether at some point of theology that when you didn't quite, is it God one person or three or what is he? These are all the excuses that are used, but the fact is, did you submit to Rome or not? When your priest died or retired, did your next priest come sent you from Rome, or did you try to pick one yourself? And we know the answer to that one. In fact, I remember some years ago I was living in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and there was a Catholic church there that was prospering. It had a lot of new members. It had a lot of energy, and they were doing quite well. And then suddenly one day, the priest who had been running this church disappeared. He was sent someplace else, and this guy was sent there by the bishop to run the church from then on. And clearly it was that, they saw, here's a profit center, we're going to take control of this and get rid of this popular priest and put our guy in there who'll do whatever we say to do. And that was just like, and I was like, when I saw this, I thought, are you guys going to put up with this? Is this just the way things work in the Catholic Church? The bishop, whatever he says goes? And apparently that's the way it works.
That was really, if you ask me, though, a scary time to live in. It's almost like they were sacrificing their own people as well as others, but yet they weren't doing it, it wasn't like doing it for a cult of the dead. It was really more out and out murder, but you know what I'm saying. It's, useless sacrifice, in other words.
Well, they wanted to control things. I mean, that was, I don't know how else you can say it. They wanted to control who the priests were. They wanted to have as much political power and economic power as they could, and they took every step necessary to do that. And whether it was going in and just killing pagans, that was fine, and that didn't bother them, or taking their churches or whatever political step it took, they would just do it. They never thought about the right or wrong of it, no.
Yeah, at this point, Earl, I'd kind of like to move ahead a little bit and then come back. I mean, I'm getting to about question 3, but I want to move ahead to question 9 and come back to 3, because you're touching on question 3 right now, so I figured, question 9 now, so I think now would be a good time to cover it.
Okay.
Can you tell us if the Mother Church ever endorsed the cult of the dead? By the cult of the dead, I don't mean the cult itself, I mean the practices of the cult of the dead.
There are some people in the church right up to the time of Constantine who talk about the ointments and how important they are. So I would say indirectly, and based on the documents that still exist, because there may be who knows how many things that were destroyed, but based on the documents that still exist, I would say that the cult of the dead was still active right up until about 400.
Okay, now,
time of Constantine, yeah.
I meant the Mother Church because Constantine is who started the Mother Church, so this would have to be after his time.
Oh, after the churches got control of the Roman government, there was less and less reason to continue with the cult of the dead, and they moved away from the use of hallucinogens to just simply reverencing the dead. There was still this sort of empty spiritual activity, where they would regard the dead as saints, and they would have saints' days and the celebrations and so on. But I think that the actual use of hallucinogens after about 400 dropped off pretty quickly, except maybe among the Gnostics. Now, the Gnostics probably continued, but as far as the church in Rome and the churches that the Rome controlled, I think it dropped off pretty quickly right after 400.
So this here getting away from the cult of the dead was something that probably the Romans had a problem with, not the early Christians.
Right, because the problem with these hallucinogens is that if you use them, you have a vision yourself of what the afterlife is about, and you don't need a priest. And in fact, you might even believe that what you've seen and experienced is more important than what the priests are saying. In fact, that's the problem they had with the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, on the way to Damascus, had this vision, and from then on he said, well, I'm just as good as the rest of you guys. I'm just as good as you guys who knew Jesus, because I've seen Jesus in the Spirit, while you only knew Jesus in the flesh. And he had kind of the Apostle Paul felt that he was more in touch with Jesus than the people who had actually known him in the flesh in Jerusalem. And that caused all kinds of problems, because the Jerusalem church and the churches that Paul created were not exactly in sync. That's a nice way to put it. They weren't. There were a lot of arguments. Let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, it was apparent even in the Bible itself that Paul and the other apostles just did not see eye to eye.
Right.
Which I think Paul was probably more of a supporter of the cult of the dead than, say, the other apostles may have been, but I could be wrong about that.
Well, I think the problem in Jerusalem is that if you're a Christian at that time and you're one of the leaders of this new church, I think you were probably watched very, very closely by the authorities, and I don't know that you had much opportunity to or leeway to do much of anything else. I'm sure that Peter and the rest of them living there in Jerusalem were being watched constantly by spies from the Jerusalem temple who were very concerned to keep an eye on you and what you were doing. So they may have moved away from it just for reasons of self-preservation. Whereas Paul, who was off away someplace, he could get away with stuff.
So you think perhaps Jerusalem had a problem? Well, yeah, you did mention in your book, I think, that Jerusalem wasn't any fonder of the cult of the dead than the Romans were, which leads me to see a pattern developing here that perhaps secularism is what really frowns upon the cult of the dead more than the religious world does.
Well, I'm not sure by secularism. Well, yeah, I see what you're saying. Once a church becomes secularized, like once they get away from the origins, once they become an institution, like the Jerusalem temple or the the church under Constantine, they start trying to move away from these things that detract from their power, because if your people are having their own rites, if people are going to graveyards and communicating with the dead or communicating with the spirit world directly, well, they don't need you. You know, you're just an obstacle to them experiencing God directly, and so why should they listen to what you say? See?
Right.
Yeah, the secularization of the church is you're right. Yeah.
You know, that would make a lot of sense, Earl, if you think about it, because if you trace back, a lot of the dogmatic rules has become attached to the church just since the days of Constantine. I think a lot of them could probably be traced back to the institutions. In other words, more than it probably would have been before, when that was the Cathars and the Gnostics and some of those.
Well, the thing about the Cathars in particular is they didn't seem to go in for building great big cathedrals. They didn't. They were just these poor people who traveled about the country, and they took vows of poverty, and they actually took their vows of poverty seriously. And part of the reason why they were so much trouble for the Catholic Church is because these Cathars were very pious. They were poor. They helped people, whereas the Catholic priests who were in the area were all grubbing for money and seducing each other and doing things that were not very priestly. And
right.
So, and in fact, that was the funny part, that the Cathars were called the good Christians. Well, if the Cathars are the good Christians, then what are these other guys?
Yeah, really.
The mediocre Christians, the bad Christians? I mean, that was pretty clear from the time anyway. That's the attitude that they had there in the south of France. So the Cathars were popular among the poor people because they actually talked the talk and walked the walk. They believed in poverty, they believed in helping people, and they weren't all about money and power and seducing people and doing that stuff.
Now, one of the things also you was mentioning in your book was Jesus wanted to fulfill the law of Moses, pardon me, by primarily restoring respect toward the blessed dead. Can you give me some examples of things that Jesus said or did that show in specific, hard to claim it meant something else type terms, that he was in support of the cult of the dead?
Well, there's a passage, what's it, Matthew? There's actually a place in there where he talks about the fact that there's a story he says where there's a passage where he accuses the priests of wrongdoing, and one of the things he says that they've done is that if someone takes their money and gives it to the church, then they don't have to honor their fathers and mothers. Now, this passage seems kind of peculiar to us because I don't think anybody at the time was saying, just let your mom and dad starve in the street. I don't think that's what they meant. I think the criticism was that all the money that people had that used to go to local shrines and cemeteries, or the family plots or family cemeteries, the church in Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem was saying, well, you can give that money to us. You don't have to maintain those graveyards. You don't have to worry about your parents, your grandparents, your ancestors. And that's one of the things that Jesus criticizes them for, because he says, no, it says in the Bible you have to honor your father and your mother, and that means that you should maintain those family graveyards and those family rites and rituals that are traditional. You don't take the money from that and just give it to the Jerusalem temple. That's wrong. And he's said similar kinds of things. He talks about, in one place, about the fact that the priests in the Jerusalem temple were building these big shrines to famous prophets, and trying to make themselves look good by doing this. And Jesus said to them too, he said, this is wrong. He says, your fathers, your grandfathers, they were the people who killed these prophets. They were the people who persecuted these prophets, and now you're going to, who've benefited from this, now you're going to build this big shrine to this dead prophet and say things like, well, if I had been alive then I wouldn't have done that. Well, we all know, everybody here knows that it was your grandfather and your great-grandfather who was actually involved in killing these prophets of God. So how can you claim now to be free of the guilt from that? But there's things like that where Jesus clearly was talking about the need to maintain support of the family tombs and a more traditional, I guess I'd almost call it a populist version of Judaism rather than this centralized belief that existed at his time where everything had to go through the Jerusalem temple.
Yeah, I've read before that it wasn't just what you're referring to now, but about the time Jesus come around, everybody had gotten away from the original laws of Moses, and Jesus was trying to restore not just this law, but many, many laws, in other words, and get people back on track. And any good he did, Constantine come around and undid.
Well, yeah, that's very true. I think of all the people who are prominent in the history of the Christian church, probably St. Augustine had more to do with attacking the cult of the dead and getting rid of all the things associated with it than probably any other person you could name. He very actively tried to strip away anything that had any connection with the dead, whether it was passing rules when he was bishop in bishop in Africa, prohibiting people from bringing, having a dead body in the room when the Mass was performed. There was also a thing that when someone died, they would have a Mass and you would actually put the host in the mouth of the dead person. And he had rules passed that stopped that. So I think it's pretty clear that St. Augustine was doing everything he could to try to suppress these old rites in favor of people just looking to the church and like sheep and saying, "This is what do you want me to do?"
Interesting.
I'll jump how high, you know.
You mentioned that, and my next question was going to be about what you're just talking about, only a more specific question about it, and that is, what do you suppose the purpose was of putting sacred food into the mouth of the dead?
Well, that's actually a very good question. I'm glad you asked that one because this is something that was true both in Egypt and in ancient Greece. For example, in ancient Greece, the rite used to be that when someone died, you put what they call a sop of bread or a bit of bread into the dead person's mouth. But over time, that changed. So instead of putting the bread in the corpse's mouth, they would put a coin, and they would say the point of the coin was to pay your way across the lake of the dead to the next world. Now, when they put the bread in the person's mouth, they said, well, this bread is for the dog Cerebus, that you throw him the bread and then you run past before he realizes you're there. And that was the story about why you did that. But the same thing, something similar, very similar, was going on in Egypt. And they had a rite that was called the opening of the mouth ceremony. And if you read the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and in fact, E.A. Wallace Budge, who was a famous Egyptologist, said too, that the opening of the mouth ceremony was the most important part of the burial ceremony. Because at that point, the dead person became immortal. And the way they did this was, first of all, it's kind of a complex process, but first of all, when someone died, you go and you would cut them open and remove their internal organs, and then you would, and those internal organs are put into 4 jars called canopic jars. Then you would apply various oils and other things, and particularly cedar oil, to the internal flesh that was left behind and other stuff, and then you would sew them up. Then you would wrap them in these bandages, and then they would then be ready, essentially, I guess after they aged a little bit, but eventually here they'd be ready for the funeral ceremony. Now, this sounds really bizarre, but when I explain it to you, you'll understand why they're doing it.
Okay.
They take the body, now this sounds weird, they take the body and literally lean it up against the wall. So here you've got this mummified body that's wrapped up in bandages, and it's leaning backwards with its head touching the wall at kind of an angle. And at that point, they have the ceremony. Now this ceremony actually became very complex over time, where they would bring in this thing and that thing, and they would pour out the water, and they'd pour out the honey, and they'd have all these little rituals that were involved. And it could take hours and maybe even take days to get all these things done if you did the full ceremony, the full rite. But the most important part of that rite was when they would come up to the body, and they'd use this little iron tool, like a little, it looked like imagine a 4-inch crowbar, because that's what it looks like. They'd take this little iron tool, and they would pry open the person's mouth. And then they would insert this little, in the pictures it looked like a little round ball, but it's about the size of a marshmallow, okay? And it looked like kind of like a marshmallow too. And they would stick that in the mouth, and at that point they would say, the dead man is immortal. Something about that rite of prying open the mouth and then putting this thing in his mouth was what made the person immortal. Now, my belief is that little thing they put in his mouth was actually some kind of mixture that included mushroom and mushroom spores, and that the whole point of the rite was to shove it in his mouth and shove it far enough back that it would fall down his throat and into his abdomen, where it would then germinate. Because that's the other word that the Egyptians used quite often. When someone had become immortal, they were said that he has germinated, which has to be the strangest translation I could ever imagine. But apparently that's what Budge said that word meant, and I'm willing to take his opinion on it, that the word they were using means to germinate, because they believed at that point, from that point on, he had actually become immortal. And so I think that's why they were putting these things in the mouth, because whatever it was had either come from another body or might have had fluids from another body, and probably had spores on it too that would be carried into the body.
Wow. I would have never thought about that. But you know, E.A. Budge, he would be the one who's considered an authority on ancient Egypt.
He described some of these rites, like the rite of taking fluids from dead bodies, these desiccated fluids, and Budge said things like, this sounds weird, and he says, and I don't understand why they're doing this, but I have enough faith in the Egyptians to believe that they knew why they were doing it. And that was, to me, is the key thing in looking at history. We may now look back and wonder, boy, that's really weird. Why were they doing that? But I'm willing to believe that the Egyptians and the Greeks were doing it for a reason, and they probably had a very good reason for why they were doing it. And I'm not willing just to say, well, they did it because Grandpa did it or great-grandpa did it or somebody way back when did it. I don't
believe the Egyptians operated like that.
Well, I mean, they built an empire. They knew what they were doing. And, they must have had some reason for these really strange rites, or at least they seem strange to us today. But I think that what I've accomplished is I've come up with a logical reason for why these things happened, or at least how they started. Now, how long they continued after they got started, that's impossible to tell. I mean, did the Egyptians continue this through the entire first dynasty? Through the Old Kingdom, or did they do it through the Middle Kingdom, the Late Kingdom? At what point did they stop, dealing with the whole mushroom issue? And I don't even know that you could tell anymore at what point they may have given up on that aspect of it. Maybe they continued it right up till 600 A.D. I mean, I don't know.
Well, there's also, by the time you're talking about 500, 600 A.D., I think you just said, or even B.C., there had already been changes in government, and the whole religious system and everything had changed in Egypt, and it lost its splendor by that time.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much certain that this was going on during the Old Kingdom, the first 6 dynasties. But they had a major political collapse at the end of the Old Kingdom, and they also, in the centuries after that, they were also invaded by the Hyksos rulers who took over. So there may be a break in there someplace, or maybe there was a situation where the priest said, okay, we're going to continue doing this, but we're not going to tell the Hyksos rulers what we're doing, and it may have become more secretive. So it's hard to tell how long it continued. I'm pretty sure I can say with confidence that the Old Kingdom was definitely doing it, because there's plenty of stuff in the pyramid texts that point to it. How long to continue after that is much more difficult to figure out.
Okay. Now, I got so carried away with our conversation, I forgot to mention that there is Earl doesn't have his own website, technically, per se, that I know of, unless he's gotten one since the last time he was on my show. However, he does have information that everybody can find at www.goodreads.com/Arthur/show/277396.EarlLee. And I'd encourage everybody to go there. Goodreads has got a lot of interesting articles, not just Earl's, and you might have a fascinating time reading everything over there. And I do apologize that I'm just now getting to that, but, you know, you're so interesting, it just kind of took my mind off from it.
Well, actually, one thing that your listeners could do that would be helpful, too, is to contact your local library and ask your local library to buy a copy of my book. That way it can get out more into the public. And I think most libraries now have online pages you can just fill out. You don't even have to go there. Just go ahead and fill out, just say put my name, my book in there, and ask them to order it. And they're usually pretty good about doing that.
Now, that's an interesting point. I know I've seen other people's works over there, like William Bromley. He was the author of The Gods of Eden. And, you know, there's been some of Zachariah Sitchin's works over there. So I know that they will order these books if you ask them to. Now, one of the things I was going to mention coming up next was that on page 63, you mentioned some of the symbolism used for these mushrooms. And I was going to ask you, because, I mean, I read the symbolism, and some of them stuck out like a sore thumb. But I was going to ask you if you could share what they were.
Okay. Is there one in particular you're thinking of? Or?
Yeah, actually there is. Okay, I was reading page 63 of chapter 4 of the first page, Ritual Cannibalism and the Magic Foods. According to Dan Russell's Shamanism and the Drug Propaganda, the use of hallucinogenic plants is virtually universal in the ancient world. In addition to psilocybin, and that's a word I can't pronounce, another hallucinogenic mushrooms like the Amantia muscaria. Anything that's medical terms is Greek to me.
Let me suggest this as one symbol. There are several books that write about the early Christian church and the symbols that they used. And one that was very popular was an anchor symbol. Now, I'm not sure where that, I think I have my own idea where it comes from, but I can't figure out where from the Bible you come out with an anchor as a symbol for Christianity. But later on, and more recently, people who have gone back and looked at the anchor symbol said, well, the reason they had the anchor symbol is because you have this anchor, and you have the wooden part that goes up, and then there's a cross piece that goes on the wood. See, so you actually have a cross built into the anchor, and they say that's why the Christians use the anchor symbol. Well, I've got news for you. I've looked at several books on the Christian catacombs, and I've looked at a lot of anchor symbols, and many of those anchors do not have a crosspiece. I know modern anchors today have a crosspiece, so it's easy to lift them, But I'd say the vast majority of the anchors that I saw reproduced in these 19th century books on the catacombs, the anchor doesn't have a crosspiece. So that's not a very good explanation for
No, it's not. And I'll be honest with you, what I read was the idea from the cross was really derived from the ancient Egyptian ankh.
The ankh symbol, I think there's a good argument for that. I also think that the Egyptian ankh actually represents a mushroom, because you have this lobe-shaped eye, and then you have this little stalk coming down, okay? And I think that's what it is. I think the ankh, if you look at the Eye of Horus, I think the ankh comes from the Eye of Horus, and if you look at the Eye of Horus, you can see it's this lozenge-shaped thing with a little stem coming down, and if that's not a mushroom, I don't know what it is. It sure looks like one to me.
Actually, you know what? There was like 2 or 3 of these that stuck out to me. but the symbols were called the burning bush. That one actually stuck out because Moses talked to a burning bush, and that's where he found God. So now you have to wonder, does that mean that he had actually ate one of those mushrooms?
Well, I think that Moses brought together, created a religion that was based on the Hebrew cult of the dead and the Egyptian cult of the dead, and he used the elements from both those, and he was also, as a higher up in the Egyptian palace, he would have known a great deal about what the Egyptians were and weren't doing, and he sort of picked and chose the things that he thought were the most important. So I think that, there's this very strong possibility that what he was finding on the mountain was this fiery red mushroom, and that was the source of his visions.
And I hear another one of the symbolic names is Tree of Life, and everybody knows where the original Tree of Life is mentioned at. So, and you mentioned somewhere further in your book, I forget exactly where, that, actually I think you mentioned it in chapter 10 under Immortality, that and originally that it is thought that the Tree of Life was probably named after that same Tree of Life in the garden, in other words. Or that the Tree of Life in the garden was actually one of these fiery red mushrooms.
Yeah, that was an argument that Robert Graves put out some years ago. I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with Robert Graves, but he was a novelist and a scholar who wrote, if you've seen the film I, Claudius, that was based on one of his novels. But he also wrote a book on the mythology, I think it's called Old Testament mythology, that he wrote with a man named Patai. And in that book, he says that he thinks that the Tree of Life was an amanitum mushroom, and he makes his argument there for it.
I'd like to get that book because I mean, I can understand what you're saying, but yet I don't have all the details without actually reading the book, and that I think would be interesting reading. Is this author still alive? Do you know?
Graves, no, he died some years ago. He actually has a very good book called The Greek Myths, which came out in 2 volumes, where he has all the Greek myths and he shows all the different variants in the stories and tells you where they came from. So a lot of people use it as a reference book. But yeah, he was quite a remarkable man. I think one of his best-known books of this sort was called The White Goddess. And in there, he basically looks at Celtic mythology and shows all the different plants that play a role in Celtic mythology. And it's really an extensive list of all these different trees and plants and what role they played in Celtic belief. It was really quite an amazing book that came out, I think, in the 1940s.
Okay. And another thing that I saw, this one here sounds a little more unusual, but one of the symbols for it was the cross. Got any idea why they would use the cross when they're referring to the mushroom?
I think that the cross really came in, well, the usual explanation is that the shape of the cross was the letter T, which goes back to one of the gods much earlier. Let's see, what was his name? Adonis, Tammuz, that was his name. The god Adonis in Palestine was known as Tammuz. That's Tammuz. And people in the area worshipped Tammuz. And in fact, they even worshipped him in the very courtyard of the Jerusalem temple, which irritated the temple priest to no end.
Sure did.
but one thing that was common for the worshippers of Tammuz is to put this letter T on their forehead. And that's just like we do now with Ash Wednesday. The Catholics put this cross shape on their foreheads made of ashes. Well, that originates, hundreds of years before Christ with the worship of this dying god Tammuz, where Tammuz was the lover of I think it was Venus, and he gets killed, and so there is a weeping and gnashing of teeth and beating your breast and all the things that are associated with sadness resulting from death, and that was a rite that was quite common in in the Near East and in Jerusalem, and even right up into the temple courtyard. And of course, the priest of Yahweh didn't like this at all. He really did not like this at all. But that's what's preserved to this day, with the putting the cross, ash cross on your forehead on Ash Wednesday. So the cross shape, I think, is much older than Christianity. I think everybody will agree that the cross is much older than Christianity, and because you can find it in a lot of older stuff too. Just like the symbol that Constantine used, he had the Chi-Rho symbol where you have the X and the R coming out. Well, everybody says Constantine came up with that idea in about the year 400. The problem is you can find coins in Egypt from 400 BC that have that same symbol on it. So if Constantine created it in 400 AD, how come it's on coins in Egypt 800 years earlier?
Right. Of course, a lot of things that come along later that get credited should have been credited earlier.
Right, exactly. But it looks exactly like the same thing. Now, I have my own suspicion as to what that really represents, and if you have time, I'll explain that one. But
sure.
No, well, actually, what that is, in my opinion, and I've seen a lot of variations on it too, is you have the cross shape, and then you have a letter that comes from the very center of the cross that goes up, and it makes the letter P, or sometimes the letter R. But I think that what that is actually the symbol of an incision on someone's abdomen and the mushroom coming up from the incision. I think that's what that really represents. And that's what it represented in 400 BC when they were putting it on these coins. And one of the things that symbol represents in 400 BC, we know, is it represents righteousness. That little symbol is a symbol for spiritual righteousness. And they put it on coins to say, this is actually a pretty good coin. It's not counterfeit. And that's why it was included.
You know, that's interesting because anytime you see an Egyptian mummy or an Egyptian laying down in a coffin or whatever with the shepherd's staff and the ankh is always looks like at the circle up at the top of the chest, crossbar right below that, and it extends down at least part way to the abdomen.
Yeah, I think that's probably just a variation on the incision that was made in order to harvest the mushrooms. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and like I say, that could have been a variation or the original variation and symbolic of the same thing you're talking about, even from Egyptian days, in other words.
Right. Because we know that symbol is at least 400 years before Christ. Not 400 years after with Constantine.
Now, let's get down to the next one here. I'm just about to reread the same one I just had. See, as a rule of thumb, when I read these, I erase them off the document. And that time I didn't. According to your book on page 66, Keating had indicated in his book, early Christians were accused of cannibalism by Roman authorities. And I was wanting to ask you, and I think I may have asked you this already, out of turn by accident, by the Roman authorities. Was this before or after the time of Constantine? We already covered that earlier, though, didn't we?
Yeah, this was before Constantine. Yeah.
Because when I had that question in mind, I was trying to establish then, like I did on question 9 that I asked early, whether or not the church knew about it, participated in it, endorsed it, and then later on ditched it, or whether or not it ended with the onset of the church, in other words. But we covered that. Oh, wait, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question simply because so many documents have been lost or destroyed or altered over time. It's really hard to know. We do know, I can tell from the early Christian writers from like the first 200 years of the church that they were very active supporters of the Eucharist and the use of the sacred foods, because you can see it in their writings. It's very blunt. But as time goes on, it gets less and less. And eventually when you get to Constantine and after with St. Augustine, then it's clear that they're very much going against that whole thing and trying to get rid of it. Yeah.
Okay. And now, to move on to the next one. Now, sometimes when I do these shows, I don't prepare questions, but sometimes I do. And sometimes I think it helps the show flow. Sometimes I think it really just depends on the individual, what their book's about, and, other factors. But this is one that I did, pull questions out. Anyway, I get a recurring theme in your book that the body is the true source of the spirit. But here's my question. Don't this statement contradict the words of Jesus in John 3:6? That which is born of the flesh is flesh. That which is born of spirit is spirit. And also in John 6:63, where it says, it is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. And the words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that second one in particular, because the word quickeneth is, I think, very important, because I think that word and the way it's used in the Bible is very similar to the way the Egyptians used the word germinate. The flesh quickens. Now, I've heard that many times over the years when people reading the Bible and other people quoting the Bible, but what does quickening actually mean? Unless it means there's some sort of agitation, there's some sort of energy, there's something coming that's part of the body. Now, I think that what Jesus is saying in the quotes you've used is that the flesh is the flesh, the spirit is the spirit, but the two things have contact, and they clearly affect each other. I'm not sure there's a contradiction there. I think it depends on, if I knew the ancient Greek, I might be able to be more specific. But
that's an excellent point, because so many things change meaning drastically. The Greeks, they had so many words for one given concept. I think they had some 50 plus different words for love, to break it down for brotherly love, fatherly love, you know what I'm saying. Right.
And I think that what the message is there is that the spirit is the spirit, the flesh is the flesh, and they have contact, but one, I'm not even sure how to say this exactly, but they participate, but they are not tied. Does that make sense? That the spirit participates in some way with the flesh, and the flesh with the spirit, but that ultimately they're separated.
Right. Which that's my understanding of how it works.
Yeah.
But I don't want to say I'm right about that, because I don't want to be. Well, every time you seem to get sure of something yanks right out from underneath you.
Well, yeah, that's always a danger. But no, I'm not sure there's anything really there that contradicts what I'm saying. I think that it gives a kind of perspective on what the early church was thinking, but I'm not. It's a hard one. It's a hard one to.
Right. And I'll be honest with you, I knew it was going to be a hard one. I even told the listener in the chat room that I was fixing to give you a hard one. But I think it's good from my perspective to try to throw a hard question in every now and then, because I think it's really to your benefit, especially when you're able to answer it and readily. It's to your credit, in other words.
Well, I have given it some thought, and I'm not sure I really understand what he's exactly trying to say in that passage, or whether it's even translated properly. But I think the sense is that the spirit and the flesh share this world, but ultimately the spirit goes off on its own. It is not so much tied to this world. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a bunch of sense. And
okay.
Like you were saying, it doesn't necessarily have to be a contradiction. That was a question, not a statement I was making. It could also be a matter of semantics and misunderstanding and interpretation, because like you said, there's such a language barrier going on that it's hard to be 100% sure of anything.
Well, also, as much as I appreciate John, I would rather rely on Mark. If I'm going to make an argument about, the history of the thing, I'd rather go with the earlier source than the later one. But at the same time, John, I think, is clearly developing a theology that comes out of experiencing the spiritual world. And it was mainly John and his followers who continued the cult of the dead aspect of it, much more so than the people in Jerusalem. That's my opinion. I think, for what it's worth. So I'm inclined to think that there's probably an explanation, but I'm not entirely sure I know what the answer is. I'm
now,
sure
that was the best answer you could give right there. I got to have a lot of appreciation for you. Anybody that can say, I don't know the answer, is on safe ground, and they're dealing in honest water.
Thank you. Everybody I know doesn't like to say that. You almost have to force it out of them.
I'd a whole lot rather say I don't know than try to convince people it's something I'm not sure of, only to have them come back to me later and, I thought you said this, and here I am trapped and can't go anywhere.
Well, you see, I've been married for 30 years, so I know to be careful with what I say is definitely true.
I've been married for 25 years, so I'm trying to catch up to you, and I'm not very far behind.
You know what I'm talking about, Dan. You don't want to say something definitely unless you really know it for sure, because it'll come back.
Yeah, women don't forget.
No, not so far. Oh, they forget what they said, but they never forget what you said.
Pardon me again. I do apologize. I'm working on, like I say, that nasal irrigation, and maybe by my next show, it will have made the rest of the difference. Plus, I got some new stuff I'm going to order. But listeners, please just bear with that, and I do apologize. At any rate, on page 69 of your book, you mentioned two documents made available publicly during the early church that supported the cult of the dead. And again, I was wanting to know, were these published before the, early church? I mean, because I think what you're saying here is that these two documents were published, by the, the church itself, the mother church, or it was published by some of the early church fathers that were there before the church?
Let's see. You're talking about the apostolic constitutions?
That could be it. I mean, I don't have it open in front of me. I can open it up and see.
There are two documents that seem to be fairly old, but they really weren't ratified by the church until sometime later. I can't remember right offhand the
They
date.
had some of these Greek Latin names that I'm going to be stumbling over if I try to pronounce them like I did the last ones there. It looks like they're called the Dita La Scalia Apostola Verum and Apostolistic Constitutions, I think it is.
Yeah, these two documents were actually, I think, written somewhere around 375, 380. And basically they're just documents that tell the individual churches how they're supposed to run things, what the rules are. But there's certain things in them that suggest the history of it, that originally in the earlier church, that the things that I associate with the cult of the dead were actually part of church service and were still fairly important even at the end of the 4th century. Yeah, I've gone back and found English translations and read those, and they are mostly how-to things. You do this, you do that. The priest is in charge of this, and this other guy's in charge of that, and so on. And it's nice, an interesting historical document. But there are a couple phrases in there, a couple of explanations that I found kind of interesting, because apparently one of the things that's in there, in the apostolic constitutions, for example, is that they criticize people who are unwilling to take the Eucharist. And we're not sure whether that was pointed at the Jews or some other group. It's really not clear. But I think that what they're saying there is that, yes, the Eucharist is still very, very, very important in our church, and we're not going to abandon it or change it or do anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I was trying to, while I was listening to you there, and go to the other question I have. I got one left, actually, at least document it. On page 103, you mentioned gods, but not through the normal method. And I'm like, you know what? The way I got that thing worded, I'm probably going to confuse you. So I was trying to find refine the spot in the book, but that's why I marked the page number in case I run into something like this. So real quick while you're talking, I can try to read that one page and come to that spot.
What the page talks about is basically the different kinds of plants and how important all these different plants were to the religious and spiritual beliefs of the time. And there's one really amusing story about baby Jesus that after Mary had washed the baby Jesus in this little wash pan or whatever they used in those days, she poured the water out, and then where the water was poured out, a balsam tree grew up, and that was considered to be a miracle. And the balsam tree was then associated with Jesus, and of course they used balsam oil in various rites later on, again because the balsam tree came up where the bathwater was thrown out.
Okay, here's what I got, and it may be what you were just now talking about, in fact. And I see what I did. I left some important words off. When I'm writing or typing, I got a habit of reading it and saying it in my mind, quietly, and I drop parts of it off, getting ahead of myself, if that makes any sense, and that's what I did here. But we were talking about the birth of gods, but not through the normal method. Is that what you were talking about with the bathwater?
No, that's a part of that really comes up more in the Greek legends, because apparently these various gods actually came out of Zeus's body. For example, one day Zeus had a headache, and so somebody broke his skull open, and then the goddess Athena jumped out of his skull. And then the god Dionysus was actually nurtured in his thigh. It just seems, when you read these stories, you have to wonder, where are they getting this stuff from? Why would Athena jump out of his skull? What is that? And my feeling is this is probably referring back to Zeus as a dead god, as a god who's dead, and then the things come from his body after he's dead, and that's where new gods come from the bodies of the old gods.
Now, that sticks out in my mind because there was an old mythological story about, I think it was Zeus eating all of his father Cronus's babies, or was it Zeus's son ate all of his? And there was another one in Sumerian tales that was very similar with Enki. Are you familiar with the two things I'm talking about?
The one of Cronos eating his children, yeah, I know that one. The other one I'm not familiar with.
But at any rate, looking back at what I read in the past about that, I now begin to wonder if there was any connection to these red furry mushrooms, and maybe it was a metaphor, in other words.
Well, I think what they did is they had to come up with a mythological story to explain these things, because it's just in the nature of things that if you have a dead god like, say, Osiris, and he's in his coffin, and over a period of time you're able to harvest mushrooms from his body, at some point he's going to dry up to the point where there's nothing left, or else you're going to have to do something about it. You'll have to I guess you say, refertilize him or add something to bring that out. Now, I have some theories on that. I'm still working that out with my book on the Egyptians, but I think that it's the concept that at some point you eventually end up abandoning the old god and develop a new god who actually, sort of in a sense, comes from the body of the old god. So I think that has to do with the process. Like in some cultures, every year you had to kill the ruler and replace him with a new one. And I think it's just a matter of practicality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does make a lot of sense. You got to remember, back in those days, especially amongst the high priests and the kings, everything had a certain method, a certain procedure to be followed, and you know, they were very specific about it, and they were very strict about it.
Yeah, it seems to me that you have a person or a body that would represent the god over a period of time, but at some point it would be used up, and you would either have to add something to it or else replace it with an entirely new body. I mean, you couldn't go on being Zeus forever. It was just not possible. And I think that was the process that led to some of these mythological stories of the gods eating each other or that sort of thing.
Now, we've been into this show about roughly an hour and 20 minutes, and before we run out of time, I want to go back because you listened to the show right before the show when I did not. I didn't have time to. And you remember where we left off at, and I'm not sure if I've covered any of the stuff or gotten to any of the stuff that we didn't get to yet, and I thought now would be a good time, since it's fresh in your mind, for you to bring any other material out that we need to get to.
Well, the main thing that I think is important, and I'm not trying to make it a grand claim for my book over some others, but I think one of the most important things that I have come up with is the explanation of where Christianity came from, because that's been a problem that goes back for a couple hundred years, because you had the Greek religions, you had the Egyptian religions, you had the Hebrew religion, and then suddenly here's Christianity, and it didn't seem to fit with any of the others. And that has been an argument for Christianity for a long, long time, that, well, where could it come from then? You know, where did this come from? Because Christianity is so different from the Hebrew religion. Christianity is so different from these other religions. But I think what I've managed to show here is that Christianity already existed. Christianity was, in fact, a variation on the religion of Moses. And that what happened was that over time, the Hebrew religion, I guess you say, almost became heretical. It became so focused on Yahweh that it forgot all the other stuff or even suppressed these other elements. So Christianity is not so much a new religion as it is an attempt to go back to the old religion of Moses that existed 1,200 years earlier. And I think if people don't take anything away beyond just that itself is very, very important, because that seems to be the argument that people make about why Christianity has to be true, because there's nowhere it could have come from. And I know in the 19th century, when they first began translating the Egyptian documents, people were saying, oh, well, here clearly Christianity is like a Egyptian religion. And yeah, it was kind of like it in many ways. And then in the 20th century, they kind of shifted ground and said, well, look here, you know, Paul and mystery religions. Christianity is so much like these Greek mystery religions. And the answer there is, well, yeah, there's a lot in common there too, but there's still a lot of differences. I guess the argument I'm making is that Christianity takes something from all three. It's a Semitic Hebrew cult of the dead that was influenced very early on by the Egyptian religion and also later by the Greek religion, and it is kind of an amalgam or a mixture of all of these different elements. But it is not an entirely new religion. It is, in fact, an effort to go back to the old religion of Moses, which Jesus, I believe, felt had been corrupted by the Jerusalem temple. And I think that's really the message I would like people to think about. You know, and I'm not saying I'm not saying I'm 100% sure, but I think the evidence looks to me like this is what's happened. This is how the historical events took place.
Well, I can tell you that from my research and from people that I've talked to that are scholars and theologians, that your belief is getting very common in mainstream academia, at least amongst the theologians and biblical the people who study the Bible and things of this nature. They're coming to find out that Christianity could date back all the way to Egypt, the first dynasty, but it just wasn't called Christianity at the time.
Right. And there's good reason to believe that the Egyptians were very intimately involved in shaping the way Christianity developed in Palestine, because they were right next door. They had a vested interest in making sure that things, stayed on an even keel there. So, yeah, I think the Egyptians and the Greeks both had very strong influences, and probably some of the other religions at the time too were also influential. Yeah.
And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is the call-in number, and it's kind of late in the show to be mentioning it. It's been such a interesting interview that it was really kind of hard for me to remember, but it's 832-632-7904, and we're not quite going off the air yet, so y'all got a few minutes if y'all want to call in and, if there's anything that you'd like to tell us. And, real quick, like, Earl, I guess now would be a good time for you to cover any last-minute thoughts you may have out there.
Well, what I'm doing here is I've been working with this material for a long time, and I finally got to the point where I realized I had to break it into two separate books in order to be able to cover it properly. So this first book really does a lot more with the Greeks, and I'm planning a follow-up volume, probably would be out in about 2 years, that will focus more directly on the Egyptians and what they were doing. And hopefully, I'm figured that by that time I'll probably have enough material gathered for a third one too. Who knows? But that's the direction I'm going, and I hope to cover part of this. But there's just so many areas that I just don't know that much about. I'm not a trained archaeologist or a trained biblical scholar, but I'm sure there's things that I've missed that I could have brought in, and maybe I stumbled over a few things that people weren't thinking about. So hopefully at least this will be the start of a dialogue with other people who can look at it and say, well, I think he's right about this and this, but not about that and that, and hopefully I'll made a contribution to the scholarship in this area.
Okay. Now, somebody in the chat room was just mentioning that I'd made an interesting point on Christianity originating in ancient Egypt, and he had hoped I'd elaborate on that, but to make a long story short, what I have actually read and when I've talked to some people, there's many people out there that would believe that the god Horus was a composite of Christ. In other words, everything you say about Horus was said about Jesus. Everything that was said about Zoroaster was said about Jesus. They all had their apostles, their born on December 25th and, born of virgins. Now, the story doesn't always read, quote, unquote, but the concepts are still there. And the whole idea that I seem to be drawing from this is that this is really about the anointing of the Holy Spirit. And in all honesty, Micah Hanks, I'm sure Earl here, and even me would probably be willing to go out on a limb and say that many of the ancient shamans and Lanteans, which who knows if maybe the Garden of Eden ain't what their Lanteans really were. There's a lot of people out there that theorize it is. But the Minoans of Crete, many different ancient cultures seem to think that these mushrooms was a means of actually connecting with the Spirit. Especially, not everybody seemed to be able to connect with the Spirit without them, and some people supposedly could, but they would do these mushrooms, and they'd be able to have these visions, and they'd be able to connect with God or connect with Christ. It could have been a superstition of the time. They could have been, it could have been a dream. But if it is, it's always the same recurring dream about the same figure. Would you want to elaborate on that any further, Earl?
Well, I think we can see that there are very strong resemblances among these different religions and even religion in the New World. So I I'm inclined to think that there's something just in the very nature of where these mushrooms come from and how they're used and the kinds of visions that people have that tend to fall into certain patterns. Now, whether that's something that's inborn, is something part of our genes, I don't know. But clearly, there is a weird sort of symmetry among all these different religions. Yeah.
Well, we know that even in today's world, there are some people that seem to exhibit psychic powers, even though we know in today's world it's doubtful they're doing these mushrooms because who grows them anymore? Especially not in, cities, urban areas, what have you. So, other people are not able to make this connection. Maybe there's something in the actual mushroom that will take something dormant in a person that maybe will act as a link between the subconscious and conscious, or the superconscious and conscious, that will enable them to make this connection for people that are not able to.
Well, that was an argument that Clark Heinrich made in his book, that when he took the Amanita mushrooms, they actually made it possible for him to have a psychic connection with the guy across the room, so they could actually read each other's thoughts. So I think that's certainly definitely worth investigating. But that was Clark Heinrich's experience using the mushrooms, and he describes it in his book.
So this has actually been experimented with.
Yeah. In fact, there's a much older book written some years ago called Key of Immortality, where this one researcher named Kuharek gave mushrooms to a famous psychic of the time, and he was able to do astral projection much more vividly while using these particular mushrooms. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, you're finding areas that I haven't got around to yet.
This was back in the 70s, I think. Back in the 70s, he worked with, I think, a Russian psychic, and he gave him the Amanita muscari mushrooms, and this man described being able to astrally project to another house, and even to see what the house looked like 50 years earlier.
So he could actually travel in time, at least on a mental level.
That's what it sounded like, yeah.
His body couldn't transport through time, but his mind could.
Yeah. That was what the author suggested, yeah.
So if these mushrooms form that link I was talking about, then the people who would be eating them would probably be able to mentally travel into the future, and this is where prophecy comes from.
Well, it's interesting that you brought this up, and I'm glad you brought it up, because my wife and I have just finished a science fiction novel called The Hour of Lead, which is coming out, I think, next month, in which it's about this guy who uses mushrooms to travel back into his own past to change history. So if you like science fiction novels, it will be out fairly soon. It's called The Hour of Lead.
Maybe perhaps it's more science fact than the author realizes himself.
Well, that's my theory anyway, yeah.
Hey, I'm all for theories, as long as you remember that they're theories.
Right. You have to prove it yet. You can't just throw it out there.
Well, there's a lot of interesting things to come up in here. And, for all we know, the people that were practicing the cult of the dead were not necessarily the same folks that were actually sacrificing. There could have been more than one cult, and one of them, they might have always just waited till the people were dead and grew the mushrooms in them. And other ones, they were always sacrificing people, and maybe they were, growing mushrooms in them, and maybe they weren't doing it, but it was just part of their, way of doing business. Now, I don't know that, but it's just a thought.
Well, sure. There's going to be all sorts of different variations and practices, especially in the ancient world where you have all these different little tribes that are only loosely connected. It's like going to Arkansas and trying to find two Baptist churches that teach the same thing. That's kind of a hard one, isn't it?
Well, that's an interesting point you're making, because not only can you get two Baptist churches that agree, you can't get two members in one Baptist church to agree.
Well, yeah, that's true. I've had a number of fights over the years, yeah. Now, they didn't actually get to hitting each other, but they did argue a lot.
But, you know, the Bible, the Apostle Paul said to be of one mind. How can everybody have their own agenda, their own view, their own belief, and there be no status quo whatsoever, and everybody be of one mind at the same time?
Keep in mind, though, that Apostle Paul was participating in the agape feast and using the mushrooms, so maybe they were of one mind.
Or maybe they were, him and his followers, but maybe not necessarily the people in the church today.
No, not today. No.
But yeah, that would, if they were all eating the same mushroom, having the same vision, you would think that would be a unifying factor.
Yeah, I think that's very much of what Paul says is directly back to that experience, that people have to be joined, not just to each other, but also to Christ. And this is how you do it. And if you've got some problem, or if you've done something you shouldn't have, then you have to deal with that before you can participate again and be part of the group.
Now, also, there's the teaching about eternal life, which obviously that's not meant in the same terms as we understand it, because people would say, well, Paul ate the mushroom and he died. Paul was filled with the Spirit. Paul died. This was talking about eternal life in a different plane or a different dimension or something like that.
Right. But I think that the overall message is that once you participate in the body of Christ, once you become part of the body of Christ, then that continues, irrespective of what happens with your body.
Right, like the mushrooms were sort of like the key to open the door.
Right.
Which that didn't make a lot of sense, and, again, by the time it filters down to us and the Bible, and it's been edited and re-edited, you can see hints here and there. Jesus was clear on his instructions, like you pointed out in your book, about you can't have life without eating of his flesh. The way that passage reads, it's almost like there wasn't no room for escape, but yet everybody claims that this was a metaphor for the Eucharist as we see it today.
Well, see, that's part of the problem. So much stuff that in the first couple centuries was taken fairly literally today has all been turned into metaphors, and I don't know how you feel about it, but to me, metaphors just don't. You can't eat a metaphor. Maybe that's the wrong comparison to make, but you can't eat a metaphor, and it's hard to experience a metaphor, and I'm sure they're nice things, but even so, you actually have to have some kind of physical experience, otherwise the metaphor is just, words.
And then, too, who's to say that they were eating, per se, Jesus' body, when what he really meant was the actual mushrooms grown from?
Yeah. I think that's the way I feel about it, that they were actually having a real physical experience, not just a metaphor high or whatever that would be called. I don't know. They weren't just high on metaphors.
But there's also the thing that a lot of people would say, well, you can't eat mushrooms grown on a dead body without getting sick, but every day people eat corn and peas and everything grown in cow manure.
Yeah, in fact, magic mushrooms grow quite well in cow manure. In fact, some people argue that's why cows are sacred in India, because that's where the mushrooms come from the cow manure.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of Miles Monroe?
Of who?
Miles Monroe. He's a preacher that had a pretty good sized TV evangelism going on. He still might on some channel for all I know. I quit watching him. The thing was, he said one time that, it kind of struck my funny bone, and you're just reminding me of it, in other words. But he was talking about, the man's black himself, by the way, and I'm not prejudiced, but I'm just saying, when you hear what I'm about to say, you'll see why I wanted to point it out. But he was talking about people in Africa and how they're poor and how they're eating their own kind and their own, in some cases, their own feces because they can't get food, they can't buy food. Missionaries are going over there and feeding them and what have you. And he says, yet these people don't seem to figure out that the cow was meant to be eaten, not worshipped.
Yeah. In fact, there was back about 5 years ago, there was a scholar in India who wrote a book saying that basically 1,000 years ago, the Indians did eat cattle. And there was such a scandal that came out as a result of him writing that book that he actually got fired from the university. That's how tied they are to that whole business. And the idea that their ancestors actually ate cattle, that was just too much for him. He ended up getting fired.
Which, in all honesty, every time you have a steak, you have a hamburger, you're eating a dead animal, then it can't be that much further from a human.
Well, yeah. I mean, what's the difference between cow flesh and human flesh? In fact, that the word the Polynesians used, they called human beings were called long pig, because apparently human flesh tastes very much like pork.
Really? Now I'm wanting to start a new diet. But there are cases of people who have been stranded on islands and that they did resort to eating each other for survival. Yeah,
in fact, there's that plane crash in the Andes where they had to eat each other in order to survive. It was a soccer team from, was it Paraguay or Ecuador? But their plane crashed in the mountains, and they survived up there like 3 or 4 months. And when they finally got rescued, people were asking, well, how did you survive for 3 or 4 months? You had hardly anything in there. And then finally they admitted that they had actually started eating each other, and that's how they survived.
So they didn't all survive then?
Well, no, the ones, a group of them died in the plane crash, and they were eaten, and then they had an avalanche that killed some more, and then they ate those. And in fact, when there were 3 of them who were going to leave the plane, what was left of it, and try to climb across the mountains and find help. And as they were walking away, one of the guys stopped and came back to the plane and said to them, he said, I know that out of respect for me, you haven't eaten my sister, but I'm leaving now. I'm not coming back. And he just left because he felt that they needed his permission. His sister had died in the avalanche, and so he was given that permission to go ahead and eat her because he knew they were running low on food again.
Well, that was a pretty noble thing to do.
Yeah, I think it was. In fact, one of the men who first came up with the idea of eating the others compared it to the Eucharist. And he says, well, just like we eat the flesh of Christ every Sunday, we should be willing to do this, because this is necessary to live.
Yeah, but the way that most people are raised today, most people would look at it one time and go, ew!
Well, keep in mind, these are people from Paraguay who were in a community where they raised their own beef, so I imagine they were a little less fastidious
squeamish.
Than we are. Squeamish, yeah. True.
But letting everybody know, y'all want to learn a little bit more about this, you can get his book, From the Bodies of the Gods, at Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and other major book-selling stores, either online or at the mall or wherever your local store is at. In addition, you can scroll down below the chat room to the description of the show, and below the description, you'll see his book linked to Amazon there, and all you got to do is click on it. It'll take you straight to Amazon, and I'll get a small commission on the sale. So I'm not against people using my link. Got to plug in for myself there.
Sure.
Also, for other people, y'all may not be aware because I put this all the way at the bottom of the page, and it may not be getting much attention, but I do have my own little shop over at Cafe Press where you can get your own Paranormal Palace, Paranormal Paraphernalia, things like caps and T-shirts and coffee cups, towels, all kinds of things. And they have one of my pictures that a friend of mine made for me on the actual product itself. And if you scroll down to the very bottom of the page, you'll see Paranormal Palace Store, and it's linked over there. And, you can feel free to go over there and get it. And if y'all don't like the picture that's on there, let me know, because I've been considering looking for another one anyway, because I figured that might be hindering the sales of those T-shirts and that I thought it would be nice to get out. And in fact, you yourself may look into that, because it doesn't cost anything to actually open up this Cafe Press.
Oh, okay.
You can do it, and they'll take a commission of the sales, in other words. Now, if you want to go with an upgraded version, you could pay into it, and then you can actually customize it to blend in with your website, in other words.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good idea, yeah.
Put your book cover on a coffee cup.
Well, I've been thinking about that. Actually, my daughter does graphic arts, and she's offered to make a T-shirt for me, so I'm thinking about that, yeah.
Then you get, everywhere you go, you'll see your friends with that in their hand.
Oh, yeah, I was going to tell you, too, there's a story written by Mark Twain where he describes a train getting stuck in the Rockies in the snow, and they got to the point where they decided they had to eat each other to survive, and so they tried using parliamentary procedure to figure it out. And so one person would nominate this person, and he would decline the nomination, and someone would nominate somebody else, and he would decline the nomination. This just went on and never got anywhere.
Not exactly. That's interesting you should mention that, though. I mean, I know it's a funny joke, but doesn't it take you back to ancient times and make you wonder, how did they actually get people to volunteer to die?
Well, evidently, it wasn't that hard. It seems strange to us today, but yeah, it probably wasn't really that difficult. If you assume that, if you really believe that by doing this you would be joined up with the gods, maybe it wasn't hard to find volunteers. I don't know.
Now, see, that party you were just telling me about, maybe somebody should have told them they'll get to join up with the gods.
Well, that would have been a better sale, yes, definitely.
If they would have clicked them in today's age, people don't buy that so easily. Okay.
Well, yeah, it's getting the volunteers, but you see, keep in mind we're all descended from people who didn't volunteer, so.
Now, real quick, do you have any other things going on that you'd like to tell my listeners about? Book signings, other interviews, upcoming events, or anything at all?
Yes, there's a interview Wednesday night. I don't have the information on it here, though. I will email it to you if you'd like to put a link up to it. But yes, I'm doing another interview Wednesday night on a radio show. Yeah.
Okay. Well, send that information to me, and I'll post it to groups I'm in and social networks and places of that nature. I don't have a problem with that at all. And maybe you can post a link to it on my site as well. And when do you plan to come out with this new book you were telling me about again?
It's probably going to take about 2 years.
About 2 years.
Yeah, I've had to do a bunch more research. I'm reading a lot on the catacombs of Rome and finding a lot of really interesting stuff. And I plan to put that together with the Egyptians, and I think it'll make for a really interesting book.
Now, is this going to be on the same topic?
Yeah.
But it's going to be a little more in-depth?
Yeah, it'll be focused more on the catacombs and also on the Egyptians and what they did.
Now, the catacombs, you're talking about the catacombs that are under the old Jerusalem?
Oh, mainly the ones under Rome.
Oh, under Rome.
Yeah, the Roman catacombs, yeah.
And do they have, evidence, artifacts that indicate that this was happening under in those catacombs?
There are a number of very odd artifacts. I'm having trouble. I'm sort of spinning around my head trying to figure out what these things were used for and what it means. But yeah, there's definitely, I definitely have issues with some of the things in the catacombs that some of the, as I described earlier, the anchors that don't have cross pieces and some of the other stuff is really rather odd. some of the glasses they found down there for supposedly for the Eucharist, but are very odd. There's a lot of details that are just very, very odd. I hate using that word over and over again, but a lot about the Roman catacombs is very, very odd, and I'm still trying to puzzle over my head and figure out. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to keep your phone numbers and your email address, and I'm going to hope to stay in touch with you. You know, I'd love to have you come back, especially when you get out with this new book. In fact, I might try to clip me a copy of it.
Okay.
I'm not against learning. I mean, if you're not learning, what are you doing?
Well, yeah, exactly. I wish everybody had that attitude.
But in the meantime, I'm going to let you get on with the rest of your weekend, and I'm going to get on with my beans and rice so it'll be ready in time for supper. And I got to tell you, it's been a pleasure to have you here, Earl. It looks like we actually had time to finish the show this time. Aside from the fact that I'm still got a little catch in my throat, I think things went really well, and I think we do well together in an interview, and I look forward to having you back.
Well, I look forward to being back, too, because this is really a pleasant experience for me, being a chance to talk about the ideas I'm working through and the evidence I've turned up. And so this is helpful to me, too, yeah.
Okay. And you'll get an email from me in the next couple of days with the links to the archive versions like you did the last time.
Okay. Okay, great.
Okay, doke. Then I'll talk at you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, everybody. That was a very interesting conversation, and I think, in my opinion, a very productive conversation. You know, as far as do I believe that people were doing this, I think it's very possible that they were actually maybe, you know, doing the mushrooms. There's plenty of evidence that shows that ancient shamans as well as other groups were actually using hallucinogenic mushrooms. You can get Micah Hanks' book, Molecule Mysticism and Magic, and he covers it in some detail. God knows there's many other books out there about it. It's maybe not the sort of thing that people in today's world wants to hear about, but you know, if it is a part of actual history, no matter what it sounds like, I think it's something that we need to hear about. I mean, at least it gives us a better, you know, more rounded, more complete view of our origins and how we got where we're at today. And perhaps it can explain some of the, you know, things that we're doing today a little better than what we got it explained right now. I want to remind everybody to go to the World UFO Today site, learn a little more about them. There's some pretty good people. Of course, it's not for another year now that it just passed, but still, you can bookmark their site. You could help them get their, you know, link out to other people, share it with people that you think would be interested. Don't forget to visit my friends at Supernatural UFO Forums. Great place to learn. And don't forget to visit my friends at United Paranormal International. And there's also the radio shows that I invite people to go to. And I'm fixing to come to that in just a second. I'm checking one more thing. Okay, that's still offline, so we won't worry about that. Don't forget to visit my friends at UKPN Radio, Gary Brown, Jim Harold, .com, The Gralien Report with Micah Hanks, Ohio Exopolitics with Mark Snyder. If you'll click on the link in the menu on your left that says Radio Favorites, you'll find banners linked to each and every one of these sites. I think you'll enjoy them once you do get there, if you do go. If not, don't forget to tell people about my show. Don't forget to come back. If y'all can help me get a crowd built up in that chat room, we'll have more people to talk to during the live show. I'm going to let the show go at that real quick and get back to my weekend. I hope you guys enjoy what's left of your weekend. And one more thing, don't forget to come back and see me on Tuesday. We're going to have Gordon Johnny Noto returning, and this time he's going to be talking about moon anomalies. So let's come in and give him an ear Tuesday evening. I'm sorry. Scratch that. Monday, August 13th, which is this Monday, at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you live on the West Coast, you're more than likely 2 hours behind me. If you live on the East Coast, you're more than likely 1 or 2 hours ahead of me. The time zone can vary depending on how far east or how far west you are. It's kind of hard for me to, without knowing where you're at, get you a time zone. But you can Google what time is it in Houston, Texas, and it will tell you what time it is here in Houston, and you can look at your clock, and that will give you you can either subtract or add the difference and know if you're an hour ahead, 2 hours ahead, or behind, and give you an idea what time it is in your time. That's what I usually do with my guests at any rate, which works pretty good. And I want to thank my listeners. I couldn't have a show without them any more than I could have a show without my guests. And I'm going to sign off now. Thank you very much. Y'all have a great weekend.